Welcome back to another episode of the Brawn Body Health and Fitness Podcast. Joining me today is Lee Throckmorton. Lee and I are going to be discussing strength and conditioning considerations and needs analysis for firefighters. So as you'll hear, Lee has an extensive career working in public safety and emergency response, and Lee shares a lot from his experience working in that field, in addition to a lot of different things he's learned from the strength and conditioning side. This is a great episode, and I highly recommend it to anyone who works in the strength and conditioning, PT, chiropractic, sports med type spaces, and anyone who is working with firefighters or first responders or wants to learn more about how to best serve that population. Enjoy. Lee, welcome to the podcast. Super excited to work with you today, man. Thanks for being here.
Thank you. I appreciate you having me.
Yeah, man. For people who aren't familiar with you, maybe they don't know your backstory in firefighting, or maybe they haven't heard about your latest project there with Kaizen Groundworks. Would you mind filling them in a little bit about who you are and all the incredible things you've been up to?
Well, my name's Lee Throckmorton. I am founder and CEO of Kaizen Groundworks, which is a tactical athlete preparation platform that specializes in preparing tactical athletes. And I started that recently after retiring from a 30-year career in public safety, which spanned a few different occupations. Mainly the bulk of the time was spent in the fire service and working for an ocean rescue, high volume ocean rescue department in Southeast Virginia. Spent 20 plus years there, 26 years in the fire department at the same time. Did a little stint in law enforcement and had just dabbled in SWAT just a little bit on the training side. So I've got a robust professional resume from the last 30 years or so, and I'm looking at staying in the tactical community in the public safety space and helping some folks that come behind me be better prepared for their day one, whatever that is.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. And first, we got to thank you for your service there, Lee, because it's the time and effort and energy of people such as yourself that give people like me a lot every day that we take for granted, whether that's just general safety or knowing when that fire alarm goes off, that someone's going to call and respond to whatever situation we find ourselves in. That's something I think a lot of people take for granted. And as you mentioned, you've kind of shifted now towards more of a tactical athlete training realm. And when I think of different groups of individuals like firefighters that you mentioned, I feel like everyone kind of knows what a firefighter is, but especially in the strength and conditioning, PT, chiropractic, and the overall health and medical community, I feel like we don't really have a good understanding of how to provide for a firefighter. We might think we do, but I don't think we really grasp what a firefighter needs to do when they go out on call. And I think ultimately when we think about something in the tactical space such as firefighting, getting someone just 3% stronger, for example, that can mean a very drastic difference when you have to respond to a call. That could mean the difference between saving and not saving someone or something. So this is certainly a unique population to work with, a unique population to serve. And I really want to dive in deep to that today. Like I've said, I feel like everyone kind of knows what a firefighter is, but for those who aren't familiar with the overall organizational structure, are there different roles or tasks that someone might find themselves doing at a fire station? And, what do those kind of roles look like? What kind of demands might a firefighter face on their day to day?
Well, we can peel back the layers of that, starting with, we'll paint with a broad brush. Firefighters, in my experience, is going to be in metropolitan professional fire departments, and those around here, that's usually what we're dealing with. That's not the majority of the country. A significant amount of the country, probably greater than 50%, are going to be volunteer departments. So they're going to be a little different. And I don't have a whole lot of experience with dealing with the structure of a volunteer department. I suspect the demands of the job itself is extremely similar, but the way the way we did things, basically any fire department is just going to be a group of people that respond for calls of service that involve threats to life, property, and the environment. And that's going to pretty much, that'll be most everybody. You can kind of divide that up at wildland and structural. And I don't have a lot of experience in wildland, but I do, my 26 years were in the structural firefighting. And our department was, like most that are professional in metropolitan areas, a paramilitary organization. There's going to be a pyramid rank structure. You're going to have privates at the bottom, the greatest number, and then it goes to lieutenants, captains, chiefs, and then that's pretty standard. And another standard aspect of the fire department is you're gonna divide calls. I'm gonna bucket them into two groups. The first group is going to be the majority of the calls are nowadays going to be EMS or emergency medical services. So a lot of people don't realize that the fire department is integral in the emergency medical services of the city that they serve. And I would say that 80% is not uncommon for the amount of total calls. So my old department was 50,000 calls for service a year, give or take. So you're looking at 40,000 of those calls annually were going to be EMS related. So that's something that has grown in the last 30 to 40 years, and that's where a lot of the efforts are going to be provided. Then on the other side, 25% are going to be fire related, and that could be divvied up into any number of things between fire alarms, structure fire, that you're actually a working fire where you would take a hose line into a house, and what you think of when you think of firefighting, and hazmat. There's code enforcement. There's any number of things to kind of divvy up of that 25% of the total calls. But those are going to be most of what a fire department is going to deal with, and getting into the demands of that occupation. Infinite combination of requirements. I mean, you've got a population of 500,000 people. You've got 100,000 occupancies, different buildings. So you can just imagine the infinite combination of calls for service that you're going to have. And what I like to do, we'll probably get more granular on the demands, but big picture, on one end of a continuum, you're going to have a day, few and far between, but let's say a day you show up at the station, there's not a whole lot going on. Maybe a holiday, you're hanging out at the station, you're watching TV, you're preparing, checking things off for calls of service. Let's say you don't have a call for service. That wasn't something that was routine for us, but it does happen. And that you could have a day where you're not doing anything at all, or you're doing fire training or physical training at the station, and that be the biggest requirement that you're going to have for that 24-hour shift. And those are few and far between, but they do happen. And as you move along that continuum from less intense to more intense, I'd say in the middle and highest frequency is going to be the medical calls. And the biggest strain for a medical call, physically anyway, is probably going to be moving a patient from point A to point B. So, they're inevitably on the third floor of the house with steep stairwell. They're going to, as we know, our population as a whole is getting more obese. That's becoming more common, that you're going to have individuals that are, the population is heavier now, and we have to transport them from point A to point B to get them to the vehicle. And that's probably going to be the most taxing requirement on the EMS side. It's just going to be that transfer. And I will go on a little bit of a tangent, because I would get into spirited discussions with my colleagues or superiors that coincidentally would be individuals that didn't do a whole lot of physical activity themselves, but they would argue that the training for moving patients from point A to point B is dangerous, and we shouldn't have to do it because of the danger and the fact that we can throw a lot of manpower at moving people from point A to point B. And in theory, that's true. In theory, that's true for most departments. We had 120 people on per shift. So in theory, we could throw 120 people at getting a large bodied individual from the third floor to the medic unit. But that's not practical, nor was that reasonable, in that you would always bottleneck at a stairwell and you would always bottleneck at a hallway. So you're going to have two people, but just because you can't get a team of people into a narrow hallway or a stairwell. So the physical demands were going to fall on two people that were going to have to carry non-ambulatory patients, whether they be supine or whether they be in a chair or up and down the stairwell, down the hallway. It's going to be on them. And if they don't have the physical abilities to do that, you're going to have to wait till somebody that does. And sometimes when an emergency medical call, the time is of the essence and we don't have time to wait. So was an advocate for people having a modicum of strength training under their belt to make sure that they were able to, you've got a 400-pound patient, you've got two people, you should be able to pick 200 pounds up off the ground and move it from point A to point B. Again, that's my tangent for strength training for the fire service and EMS service. And, I'm sure that argument is still spirited even today in my retirement. But so let's call that, getting back to the continuum, let's call that the middle of the intensity continuum. And then we go all the way to the other end. And, firefighters might argue what's going to be the most intense type of call that we would go on. I'm going to argue that a high-rise structure fire is probably going to be the most intense. And reason being is they're low frequency events, but they do happen. I mean, I was involved in a handful in my career, and it's difficult because you don't know when it's going to happen. You wake up 3 a.m. and next thing you know, you're in full gear, 75 pounds of tools and equipment. And in a high rise situation, the elevators do not work, for safety reasons, and so we don't have the elevators open on a floor that's on fire and we're not aware of it. So the elevators are out of service for most calls unless you have a high rise that's 200 floors. So most high rises are certainly well below that. So let's just say for sake of numbers, you've got a fire on the 9th floor of a high rise structure. You're going to load up upwards of 75 pounds, depending on what gear that you have. You're gonna traverse those 9 stories in a stairwell. And I challenge anybody to load themselves up with 75 pounds and walk up 9 flights of steps at a high rise. I would contend that even the most fit individual is going to feel taxed when they get to the top of that climb. And then you have to set your gear down. Somebody does a little recon, and then you fight fire. So you can imagine the difference between that and just stepping off the truck at a house. You're on the ground floor. You're going to stretch a hose line into the front door of a house and maybe not even go upstairs, and you're going 100 feet inside of a house and taking on a fire. So a high-rise fire certainly adds a significant amount of physical stress on top of everything. So on that continuum, I would say, just regular station training on one side, moving a heavier set patient from point A to point B being kind of in the middle, and the high-rise incident being on the most intense side of that continuum. So you're responsible for having the ability to tackle all of those calls for service. That is, you may not see them, you may see a lot of them, and that's the key. Is that's the mindset you have to have if you want to be effective and useful in the fire service. So, and we will break these demands down into a more granular level here shortly. But big picture, that's what we're looking at in most fire services.
Yeah, definitely. I love that breakdown. And as you were talking there, I was kind of thinking in my head, like, wow, like this is something that I don't fully understand because, as you mentioned, I come from a small town in the middle of nowhere, PA, where we have a volunteer fire department. We don't have a high-rise building in my town. we don't have, any of these different things that way. So it's one of those things that I feel like unless you get fully immersed in this world, you're not going to understand it. And you mentioning about, the feeling of throwing 75 pounds of gear on and climbing up 9 flights of stairs. I remember I started doing this when I was in college. On September 11th every year, I get on a stair machine and I climb, I think it's 115, 120. I forget how many flights of stairs right off the top of my head, but essentially it's equivalent to the height of the Twin Towers. And I do it without any kind of weight, and it kicks my rear end every freaking year. Now I try to imagine doing that with almost half my body weight added on top of me in gear. And oh, by the way, you have to get up as quickly as you can, because every second, every minute that you lag behind is putting the situation in further jeopardy. So I can certainly see where this is a very unique realm of physical demand for an individual, where you kind of have to blend strength with endurance as well. And I feel like that's something that's not overly understood from a training standpoint. Even, you mentioned transfers. I don't think of a whole lot of, gyms or that sort of thing that are equipped to train someone with transfer ability. I'm picturing like, heavy sandbag carries or lifting up odd objects, almost more like a strongman training approach than a traditional like barbell and machine training approach for the transfer training anyways.
And I agree 100%. And I've often said that a hybrid strongman approach is going to be how I would advocate that individuals train for any sort of tactical space. I think that that's a good place to start. Odd objects and that sort of stuff is certainly going to be a beneficial way to train for moving heavy things long distances at a high heart rate. That's certainly going to make a big difference.
Yeah, definitely. And kind of getting into that a little bit more here, now that we've kind of broken down our kind of general scheme of things here on our continuum, let's get into a little bit more detail there if we can. So kind of starting on that far end there, give me a little bit more. I'll let you kind of run with it here, Lee. I kind of want to see where you go with it. Give me a little bit more rundown on if I'm on the far left end of this continuum, where it's kind of the easy day at the department here.
On the easy day, and again, you're never going to know when that's going to be, but ideally you would assume that a professional fire department would have some sort of PT involved in their day. I was an officer at a station, so I kind of set up the day to what we were going to do, and I tried to make sure that we had at least some sort of occupational training along with some PT training in there at a minimum. And you certainly just trying to fit that into whatever calls for service or whatever department training you're going to have. So again, just having those things being your only physical activity for the day is few and far between. You're certainly gonna have some calls for service. And our city was pretty busy, so we had more than most. But I would suspect that in the more rural parts, the more volunteer rural departments, their calls for service are fewer and far between. So they spend most of their time either physical training or training for the job, the occupational side of it when they're at the station.
Yeah, no, I like that. And as you mentioned before, I think you said there's at your station you had 50,000 calls per year.
Yes, that was, that, and I want to say, give or take a few thousand, high 40s, we're cresting 50, as I reached retirement, so there's a good amount of work to be done. And I wouldn't say that we were the busiest city, but we certainly held our own in Southeast Virginia.
I mean, even if we go light on that estimate at 45,000, that's an average of 123 calls a day. And last I checked, there's 24 hours in a day. So that breaks down to a call almost every 12, every 15 minutes. So it's certainly the kind of thing I could see where this could become a very high volume taxing thing very quickly, especially if you're on call for a 24-hour shift.
The EMS side is a little less intense. Like I said, sometimes you're going to have patients that are ambulatory, and you can just they can assist you in getting them, or you're going to be able to get a cot into the home, and the person, you get right next to their bed and get them transferred over. But again, that's not all the time, and it's not uncommon to have the unhealthiest of people be heavy set, and they're not in a convenient place, and it's hard to get a team of people into where they are, and it's going to rely on the strength and power of the individuals that are in the room to get them where they need to go. Somebody fall, you think of the smallest bathroom in your house, and somebody falls between the bathtub and the toilet, and they're wedged in there, and that's not an uncommon situation either. You're not going to get 6 people in that room to get that person out. So, like I said, you have to have at least some basic movement skill, understand how to safely move yourself in space, how to safely move a weight in space. And this, you can imagine a human being is not as easy to move as a barbell. So I'm not advocating that we don't do barbell work. I think that certainly, building up some strength with barbell work, deadlift, squat, press, bench, all that good stuff is valuable. And I think that it's a good for everybody's program, but you're not going to encounter in the field something that's that easy to pick up, especially when you talk about humans. So you need to have some odd object. You need to have some things that are a little harder to maneuver in order to get that person from A to B.
Right. So kind of going into the demands, sounds like we need a blend of strength, endurance, and really good kinesthetic awareness of where we are in space and where whatever we're carrying or holding is in space. And, when I think of traditional exercise, a lot of people think sets and reps, concentric, eccentric, that sort of thing. But I would imagine that's not necessarily the case when it comes to, transfer training and moving a patient from one spot to another. I'd imagine it's more of, hey, we've got to go 300 feet, or we've got to go 400 feet, or we have to go upstairs, we have to go downstairs. We have to kind of negotiate and maneuver in more unique settings. And I'd imagine it's kind of difficult to replicate that from a training standpoint.
It is. And the biggest thing that's difficult to replicate, and what people just don't replicate for whatever reason, is this is generally blended with a high heart rate. So everything you do is, your lifting is never in isolation. There's usually some sort of accelerated heart rate, whether that be stress, whether that be a cardiorespiratory load. But there's going to be a higher. You're not going to be at the end of your 3-minute rest period that you've been sitting on a bench, looking at your phone or in the mirror at the gym. In between sets, you're going to be, we're moving quick. We don't have a lot of time to reconstitute. We're going to have to pick up the individual, get them where they need to go in a timely fashion, and depending on the medical emergency that we're dealing with, and do that as safely as possible for the patient and the providers. So that, I think blending that training for the EMS side of it is certainly. And to me, what that looks like is, and this goes for the firefighter as well, is finding something that safely accelerates that heart rate, whether it be an air bike, a row, a run, if you have the ability to do that and get that heart rate up, and then pre-fatigue yourself, and then start doing some carrying around and kind of see how that feels. And I think that's going to more replicate the being in the field and having to move objects, transfer them from one side of the home to the medic unit.
When you're responding to an EMS call, what are you wearing from a uniform standpoint, Lee?
Most calls you would be in long pants and a t-shirt. And depending on the time of year, I mean, if it's cold, obviously you're going to have, but you're not going to have any cumbersome PPE like you would have for when you're fighting structural fires or wildland fires.
Gotcha. So long pants, t-shirt, or some kind of jacket, and probably a pair of boots on or something like that.
Correct.
And that sounds a lot different than what I hear most people hitting their workouts in, right? Like, I don't hear most people hitting their workouts in boots. I hear a lot of people hitting them in $150 lifting shoes that have like the perfect, heel elevation and all that sort of thing. But, I think that there is a ton of value in kind of adapting your training based on, what you're wearing physically, but also the location of where it is. So you kind of mentioned before about, hey, go for a run before you train, because that's going to get a little bit more of the aerobic demand here. How about take your training outside and hit it in different weather, different seasons? When you get that fire call and you've got to do a, EMS response that way, I'm assuming you might have to move a patient when it's, 80, 90 degrees and hot and humid in Virginia. Or maybe it's in, January and it's 35 degrees and there's a snow flurry in the air, and if your whole training approach is just, in the gym, perfect climate controlled conditions, same, attire every time, I feel like you're almost doing yourself a disservice from that whole principle of specific adaptation to imposed demand.
And I agree. I think if you're an accountant or you're in IT and you're in an office, your workouts, I don't think it's incumbent upon you to put yourself in various environmental conditions that would duplicate that. But I don't disagree. I think at a minimum, you should at least be aware of what your uniform is, how it's going to encumber you, if at all, how your boots are going to affect your gait when you're walking up and down steps, carrying somebody in a chair, or just have that. Now you can recognize what that uniform is, how that uniform is going to affect you, and you can raise the ceiling physically on your coordination, your balance, your agility, and then that might just kind of take care of itself. So I think if you're in PT gear and you're raising that ceiling on that software of the coordination, accuracy, agility, and flexibility, all that good stuff, I think that you raise that ceiling, then it's gonna pay off when you get some reduction in those biomotor abilities once you put on your gear and start operating that way. But I didn't find that to be too. I think most people in public safety have the constitution that they're going to be professional regardless of, if they're in the rain, they're in the snow. I mean, I've certainly experienced it all here in Virginia. But I think that you're gonna be able to handle that if you're working out appropriately. Even if you don't get outside, you work out indoors, I think you're gonna. Most of the people I've experienced are professional enough to overcome the environment. But you do have to recognize there's going to be effects on cold. There's certainly going to be effects on the hot and humid days, and you just have to anticipate how that's going to affect you, and hopefully raise the ceiling of your abilities, and you'll be able to overcome that when the situation arises.
Right, definitely. Now, taking that same needs analysis approach and applying it to more of the high volume or high demanding type day, as you mentioned earlier. So maybe that's that 9-story high rise or higher. Maybe that's just a longer type of call where you're out there for, a longer duration of time and not so much just a shorter kind of call that way. What kind of things, where does your mind go from a needs standpoint? What does the firefighter need to do for that?
Well, we can do a needs analysis and break that down. And I think any strength and conditioning coach within their SALT can listen to this, and they can make some pretty good choices just from this information alone. So, comparing we can just even talk about just a regular standard 2-story residential house fire, second floor, let's just say. And comparing that to a professional wide receiver on a football team, I like to start with environment when I'm looking at any situation as far as doing a needs analysis, and the environment for the football player, if they're in a dome, is going to be 72 degrees with no wind, perfect conditions. Everything's going to be great. They're going to know when the game is. Tactical athletes do not. They do not know where the game's going to be. They don't know when it's going to be. It could be in 6 months. It could be in 6 hours. You have no idea. And the environment is infinite for a tactical athlete. Now, specifically talking about a house fire in the firefighter parlance, the term IDLH is an acronym that means immediately dangerous to life and health. And that's an atmospheric condition that's toxic. It's corrosive. It has asphyxiants, and it poses immediate threat that would cause irreversible health effects or interfere with an individual's ability to escape. And that's kind of what so the worst environment possible, all right, compared to a professional athlete. Worst environment possible. Certainly not 72 degrees with no wind and clear visibility. It's going to be the most dangerous environment possible, and that's just where work is done. And you can imagine inside of that, you're going to have extremely high temperatures. So Fahrenheit 4 digits, Celsius high 3 digits, depending on which you like to use. Low to zero visibility. All right, that for me was the worst. You just can't see. And imagine, walking around your home where where everything is with your eyes closed. You might be, better suited. It's still stressful, but going into somebody else's home you've never been in before and having zero visibility, high temperatures, and it's very loud. You can imagine between 10 individuals banging around the house. You've got fire. I mean, you figure a campfire is loud enough. Imagine a second floor of a house on fire. It's extremely loud. Radios blaring. So that environment in and of itself is extremely stressful, and that's going to take some bandwidth right off the top, right there. It's going to take some physical bandwidth and mental bandwidth off of you right off the top, just being involved in that environment. And as we move along from the environment, we get into time domain, and so we'll take the approach with the football player. The wide receiver is going to sprint 5 seconds. They're going to, and they know they're probably going to never run farther than 100 yards. Mostly they're going to have 30 to 40 seconds in between plays, and they're going to get to sit on the sideline and rest in between while the other offense is on the team or their defense is on the team. So they're pretty sure, and they can train easily for that time domain. And there's a gentleman named John Bennett who works in Florida and has written some great articles that I've leaned on quite a bit. And he likes to say that in the fire service, work is performed out of necessity, not necessarily designed for maximal performance like in sporting events. So that the football player is supposed to be as fast as possible, catch the ball, move it down the field, score as many touchdowns as possible. He knows that's what he or she knows what that job is, and the multitude of situations that the firefighters are going to encounter are make that impossible to train for. So you recognize that you have to take a more of a generalistic approach to your training. But again, we can paint with a broad brush to what a normal fire would be for most departments, and we can call the time domain 20 minutes or so. So you have a tank, and the tanks, I say if you're working full bore, it's going to be about 20 minutes of work, and it's going to be high intensity work. It's going to be very, very taxing, especially for newer folks that aren't used to the pace, and they don't understand. It's going to take some time and experience for them to feel how to pace work at a house fire. And you can have, depending on the fire, I would say that going through 2 tanks at a typical fire is not uncommon. And 3 tanks, again, is rare, but it does happen depending on the situation. But with each, and we'll call tank and evolution, each evolution de-escalates intensity. So with each one, the first one's going to be the most chaotic. You're going in, you're getting the fire knocked out. You're the highest heat, the lowest visibility, the highest stress. And then the subsequent tanks, the situation has stabilized a little bit. But the problem with that is your fatigue has gone with the decreased intensity. So it's still going to feel the same. It's going to be taxing all the way through. So 2 or 3 at most 20-minute bouts of significantly intense work, and then at the tail end, for those not familiar with the fire service, the last part of a structure fire is going to be what's called overhaul, and that pretty much turns the fire crew into a demolition crew. So basically, we go from the putting the water on the fire into now we're going to tear apart the rooms that were involved to make sure there's no hidden fire in the walls. We're going to cut the floors. We're going to tear all the drywall off. We're going to take all of the contents of the room. We're going to salvage what we can, and then we're going to throw the rest of it out the window if the space allows, out the window, and we're going to put water on it out there to make sure it doesn't restart a fire once we leave. Now, worst case scenario is there's no window, and gosh, I've dealt with this more times than I care to count, but you have to put the debris, you have to carry out everything from the room. You have to put the debris in some sort of tarp and carry it outside. And that is after doing everything else, that being the end of it, is extremely taxing. So for the most part, it's going to be that sort of intensity. You're going to be sub-maximal strength repeated at a high heart rate. And that's going to be the meat and potatoes of the time domain within a structure fire. So you've got the stress of the environment. You've got the longer duration time domain that usually a fire is going to last a couple hours most of the time, at least an hour, if not a couple hours, depending on the size of the fire. And so that's going to certainly extend the taxation as well. We haven't even touched on the personal protective equipment, which you did touch on as far as EMS. The personal protective equipment for a firefighter is significant, and obviously with the IDLH environment and the temperatures in the 4 digits, it's required, or otherwise you're certainly going to burn. Common sense dictates that that's not going to be somewhere you want to be in a jacket and pants. Turnout gear is heavy, and it gets heavier with sweat. It gets heavier with liquid. You're spraying water onto the fire. There's going to be steam. There's going to be water on you. It's going to increase the weight of the gear. And we're just talking about just the jacket, the pants, the helmet, the boots. It's very, very difficult to thermoregulate because you're trapped inside. To protect yourself, you have to be encapsulated, and you're going to have a vapor layer. There's no evaporation. You're going to do a heck of a lot of sweating. It's a hot and humid environment, and it affects your gait. So you can imagine having gear on that affects your gait in a environment that you can't see. So that's, again, where you have to raise that coordination and agility in the training environment to hopefully combat the risk that goes with wearing this sort of gear inside of the IDLH environment. And there's been some studies done recently. I think the University of Kentucky was where this specific study that I like to reference is talking about gloves. And wearing firefighter gloves are obviously thick. They reduce your dexterity, but they did some experiments, and they indicate that you decrease your grip strength by up to 30% just putting the gloves on. Okay, so you can imagine if somebody is not strong or generally doesn't have good grip strength, you're shaving 30% right off the top. And you can imagine if you're climbing up and down a ladder, your grip strength is mildly important, especially if you're bringing somebody else with you. Your grip strength is going to be of prime importance. And if you're just wearing gloves, shaving 30% of your grip strength off, that's something that needs to be addressed as well. And I think the worst of the PPE is going to be the SCBA tank. All right, that's the breathing apparatus and just general load carriage. And I'm sure you've experienced load carriage in all different populations. This is going to be on your back, upwards of 40 pounds. So that in and of itself is taxing. The mask and the breathing unit is positive pressure. So you are forcing it's causing you to use more skeletal muscles to breathe because you're breathing against that positive pressure. And you put the gear on, and you don't even have to go in the IDLH. Research says that you're knocking 15 to 20% off your VO2 max just by having it on. Okay, so you're going from 50 to 40 in your VO2 max. I mean, that's significant. That's very significant just without doing anything. And with your skeletal muscles and your respiratory system competing for that cardiac output, you can imagine how taxing that is if you do not have a decent VO2 max to compensate for that. And lastly, tools and hose. And tools are really not that heavy. We don't generally carry around a heck of a lot of heavy tools. They're going to be as heavy as any gardening tool that you're ever going to use. But where things get really heavy is going to be your hose line that's got charged full of water. So for every 100 feet, you're looking at 144 pounds for a hose line that's 100 feet. And most house fires are usually 150 feet of hose. So you're looking at, if it's just you're tugging on a line that's 200 pounds or more, trying to move it down a hallway with everything else that we just talked about being involved: environment, your PPE, and now you're just trying to move down the hallway with a 200-pound hose line. Hopefully you've got some help, but you can imagine that you're not thinking about, is my upper back or lower back rounded right now when I'm picking this up? Are am I braced properly? You're not thinking about that. You're thinking about how you can make an effort to save a life if need be, save a colleague if need be, or save yourself if need be. So those other things are not in your mind. So those three things, environment, time domain, and PPE, should be enough for any smart strength and conditioning coach like yourself to start to kind of plug in, the puzzle pieces as far as what the needs are for a firefighter. And it's not going for a light jog 3 days a week and then doing bicep curls and tricep push downs on Tuesday and Thursday. You can see how that doesn't work in that environment. So, and I really wanted to kind of really get down into a granular level of what this is. And that's pretty much every fire. That's, if you're getting a working fire, that's going to be what you're going to encounter. And that's not even the high rise. That's just a general run of the mill residential house fire. So it's a daunting task, and I think that it's incumbent upon people to be trained properly, physically and mentally, to be capable and useful in that environment.
Yeah, I completely agree. And just kind of recapping and breaking things down a little bit more here. First off, from an endurance component, you kind of mentioned that your tanks are operating in 20-minute intervals, and you're looking at about 2 to 3 tanks on average per fire. So essentially what I'm looking at here is we need to have the physical endurance to hold up for about 40 to 60 minutes at minimum. I'm assuming there's occasions where you have to go a lot longer than that, and there's probably some occasions that are a little bit quicker than that. But in general, we need enough endurance to last 40 to 60 good solid minutes. And that's not just endurance to last. We also want to try and do things to elevate someone's VO2 max, because as you mentioned, there's a physiological disadvantage that comes with wearing the protective gear and just being in that environment itself. So naturally, the better our VO2 max is going in, the more capable we'll be able to, physiologically withstand the demands of fighting the fire itself. From a strength component, as you mentioned, you've got 50 to 100 pounds, and I'm assuming sometimes more, of gear on to protect yourself. And that, as you mentioned, is going to gain weight as you go through the combination of sweat and water vapor that you're spraying from the hose. So you have to get used to the fact that you have a whole lot restricting your own movement. You've got a decrease in grip strength from the gloves you mentioned. And as we know, the weaker your grip, the weaker everything else is going to be, right? So if I grip right now and I make a white knuckle fist, I can actually build tension all the way up into my biceps, even though my biceps act at the elbow, not my hand. They don't grip anything. But if I grip hard enough, I can feel that tension build. It's an irradiation of tension principle. So if we kind of back that off just from equipment, then we can see how we need to raise our own training ceiling so much higher in that regard. And as you mentioned as well, it's not just the gear that we have to worry about on us. It's also the fact that we're going to have to move things, carry hoses, that sort of thing as well. So I think, from a strength standpoint, there's a lot to unpack there. And when I say that, I don't mean that, go and hit like the grip squeeze exercise. Like, I don't think that alone is the best way to improve grip strength. But I think that that's an important piece. And then taking it beyond the endurance and the strength, as you mentioned, there's an overall CNS fatigue that comes from being in the environment that you described. There's a CNS fatigue that comes from not knowing where you are and having very poor visibility. There's a fatigue that comes with, exerting a high level of force and load for such a long duration of time. And that's a fatigue that I'm willing to bet most people don't get in an average workout. And I think that this is an area where, from your workout programming and training for a firefighter, you kind of have to take it beyond the normal, 3 sets of 8 to 12 for everything. You have to find unique ways to blend, an endurance aerobic component with a strength component, but also factor in some type of CNS fatigue. And I'll take it a step further and say also factor in some type of unpredictability to it, some kind of element of chaos, because I'd imagine every time you've responded to a fire, they might look similar, but there's something different about each one. There's something unique about them. And I think in training, if we just do the same thing over and over and over again, yeah, we get good at it, but that's not always what we have to do from a life standpoint. Sometimes I think it's best to cast a wider net with our training and make sure we're ready for, 1,000 different stimuli instead of just 12 different stimuli, but we're really good at those 12 different stimuli. Because as you mentioned, when you're on the job, you're not thinking about mechanics, you're not thinking about form, you're just thinking about, I need to get this done and I'm going to do what I have to do to get it done.
And I agree. And what you alluded to is that specialization is not needed here. The wide receiver in the at the football team is a specialist, and tactical athletes are going to be generalists, and they need to cover a wide swath of biomotor abilities in order to in order to be successful. Some other things that I didn't, that you brought up of the CNS kind of made me think that this situation that I just presented, it doesn't happen as often as it did when I first got in the fire service, but that could you're there for 24 hours. This could happen again. That could be at 8 a.m. and then at 3 a.m, you got to do it all over again. So multiply all of what we just talked about, all the CNS stress, all the the physical stress, multiply that by 2. In the generation before me, it wasn't uncommon to fight 3 structure fires in the city that I came from. So multiply that by 3. And I just think that it's difficult for people that aren't in that to understand the taxation there. And it's certainly, you can understand that there needs to be smart training physically and mentally for firefighters in order to overcome these obstacles, for sure. So, we talked about, the bouts of 20 minutes, and we have a rehab situation that ideally happens in between those as well. So you get time, once your tank is out, usually that there's an indicator by a bell, and your crew goes out and everybody goes to rehab. And rehab, depending on the department, is going to be, different levels of sophistication. Early in my career, there was bravado about not staying in rehab and not drinking water and beating your chest about how tough you were and how much work you could do. But it's we're starting to get more sophisticated where we're taking metrics like pulse and BP. And there's a strength coach named Chris Henshaw who is, if anybody wants to know about aerobic or anaerobic capacity, he's the sensei as far as I'm concerned. But when he dove into the fire service, and he noted that a firefighter is only as good as how quickly he or she can recover. And if you've done your 20-minute tank and you're not trained, and you go to the rehab, and an hour later, you're still at a blood pressure of 160 over 100, and your heart rate's at 150. I mean, you're ineffective, and we can't have you go back into the structure. So that CNS recovery, that physical recovery is important for the job, so you're capable and you can make it through, because some people can't even make it through the first 20 minutes, much less subsequent hours of operation and going into the overhaul. So the resilience of in between the bouts of high intensity effort is extremely important on top of all that.
Right. You have to find a way to cultivate an art of resilience. And taking that a step further, we've talked a lot about the physical, but you mentioned it's also mental as well. And I think that's something that, I'm not a mental health professional by any means, but it can be very difficult and challenging to recover from some of these things. I'm talking beyond the CNS fatigue. I'm talking, what if you've got one of those 3 call days and the first 2 fires that you're called to were total losses? That's really difficult to get back up, I'd imagine, and go on to the 3rd one when you've already struck out twice. And while that's an unfortunate and sad situation, I'd imagine a day like that can happen sometimes. If you can't mentally keep yourself in the right state of mind when that 3rd one comes around, I'd imagine, once again, as you're alluded to, you're far less effective. So trying to find ways to not just cultivate the physical resilience and the overall CNS resilience to handle the load, but also the mental resilience to not just handle the typical day-to-day, but handle those days when things don't go according to plan.
And the mental health has become a hot button issue in the fire service. And it's my understanding that there was a white paper done not too long ago that indicated in some areas that you're more likely to there's some departments where you're more likely to die from suicide than you are die in the line of duty. Unfortunately, I think it's gotten to that level, and that cumulative effect of the mental stress that goes into it, it certainly has something to do with that. You have to look at, and a lot of times I have this discussion regularly about the mental health side of it. You have to look at, you might not have that one call that you can point to and say, whatever scenario that just sent somebody over the edge. I think more importantly is looking at the factor of how many calls for service does a firefighter go on in 30 years? I mean, 50, 60,000, contacts over the course of the year, depending on what it is that you're doing. And each one of those, I think, is a little bit of a little bit of a knock. And then there's a cumulative effect over the course of time. And getting back to the physical part of that, that's another benefit to being in a physical culture. You'll be better at your job. You'll be more effective. You'll be more capable. You'll be healthier. And we all know that there are positive effects to mental health by engaging in physical activity. So, you'll be better at your job, and you may buttress your mental health by engaging in those sort of activities. Another part to the mental side of it that we talked about is sleep. Now we can't manage the amount of calls we're going to go on in a 24-hour shift. That's the bell goes off, you go on the call regardless of how many you've gone on before or how many you're going to go on later. But prioritizing that recovery, prioritizing quality of sleep while you're on duty is important, and prioritizing your recovery and sleep off duty is going to be important. And again, these are the ancillary benefits to that are going to be, you're going to be in better shape and you're going to be a more effective tactical athlete by prioritizing those things off duty, if at all possible. And certainly setting up your on duty situation to where you can best recover, best work on your resilience, and best work on your sleep quality at the station. And I think that those are all extremely important for fire departments, and they're starting to recognize that. I think they're a little slow to catch on in some places. We're still kind of just go type A, fight or flight all the time. I certainly lived that life for quite a while, but I think people are starting to recognize the detrimental effects of this lifestyle and how much fitness plays a role in that positively. And I think that should be looked at even closer in the coming years.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with that. Having a base level of overall fitness and being able to recover from the stimulus that you throw at the body are certainly essential that way, as is just being better about taking all of your overall mental health and mental well-being. I know we're kind of running out of time here, Lee, but I really want to hear, say a firefighter comes to work with you at Kaizen there. Walk me through kind of what a general flow or general structure of a workout would look like with you. How are you kind of approaching a workout with someone who's currently a firefighter?
Well, it's going to be individual dependent, and you get 10 firefighters or you get 10 strength and conditioning coaches, and you ask them the same question. I suspect you're going to get 10 different nuanced answers to that. But the hill that I'm going to die on is I believe that, and this goes for most tactical athletes, you need to raise that ceiling on your aerobic base. You need to push that lactic threshold as far to the right as possible. And there's two reasons for that. And I'll tell you how far I want that pushed. I want that pushed so far that until it starts to affect the strength to where you're not able to manage the minimum requirements of strength for the job. So I want you to push that aerobic and anaerobic capacity as far to the right as you can, push that lactic threshold as far as you can until you start affecting that strength. And the two things that does is, we talked about the work being submaximal and repetitive. It's gonna flush that waste. Having a good aerobic base is going to flush that waste from those submaximal efforts. And we talked about it being hot and humid. Pushing those meters to the right, you're going to increase that blood volume in plasma, which is, as you know, is a coolant within the system. It's going to help you thermoregulate in a situation that's difficult to thermoregulate as well. Focus heavy on strength endurance and expose somebody as their aerobic capacity and anaerobic capacity gains. Expose them to high intensity efforts. I might have brought it up earlier, but my biggest pet peeve would be a firefighter that would just take his radio and go for a walk around the fire station. And that's their PT, right? And as you and I both know that does not even remotely come close to the heart rate demands or the strength endurance demands of a structure fire. It's just doing something to say that we did something. So exposing an athlete to occasional high intensity efforts is going to be important, so they at least understand what that feels like, and we build capacity along those lines too. And we talked about it earlier, almost a hybrid strongman, lots of carries, lots of sled pushes, lots of attach a rope to a sled and pull it. Work on getting that, in between bouts of echo bike row. That's going to be the meat and potatoes of it, as far as programming go, and just find out a way that you can incorporate these things into fireground tasks, and they can be very specific too. I mean, you can have a tire with a sledgehammer. I don't personally, but you can get that. You can get that specific to it. But I just want to make sure that an individual that comes to me has that modicum of strength, and if we need to work on that, we'll work on that. But first, we're going to prioritize their VO2 and their lactic threshold, and then we're going to start layering some strength on top of that, and then we'll throw some mixed modal light strongman type activities on them, and then just kind of layer on top of that, and just grow those wheels, each passing week, as much as we can. Just be smart. That's it. Just be smart about it. And it's gonna. And I recently had a young lady from Ohio reach out for remote training for me, and she had has zero aerobic base at all, and she found that the testing for the fire department to be very taxing, because most of her efforts were to work on strength. Most young ladies feel that they're not strong enough to be a firefighter, and they focus on that. And then when they get on a stair mill with 75 pounds of weight vest on them, and they realize that strength isn't doing anything to help them at that portion of the program, they're in trouble. So that's it. That's basically how I try to attack everybody, and get them going. But it is athlete dependent, and it's fun for me to try to figure that puzzle out and get these people to whatever goal that they have, and get them there safely as possible and as quickly as possible.
You mentioned that you had someone you're working with there, and they had a series of tests that they had to do. What kind of tests do you have to do from a fire department standpoint? Do you have to do like a hose run or a ladder climb, or?
Well, most there's two that I know of. Departments can have their own individual physical tests, but the most popular one is called the CPAT, which is the Candidate Physical Abilities Test, and that's a mixed mode, high intensity, high heart rate, sub 10-minute evolution with not a lot of rest, if any. Rest being walking from one station to the other. And it's a pass or fail as far as do you complete it in the time or not. So it looks just like if you take eight functional movements and put them together, and you're looking at, hey, you got to complete these things in sub 10 minutes, that's going to be what most departments do to get you in. And that's just to get in. Then you're going to get to the fire academy on most places, and it's just going to be that every day. So, just being able to pass the test to get in, I think, is only half of the issue. I think that you need to be academy ready on top of that. And those are important. And, people that don't prepare, they really find themselves in trouble when they get to that point. If they squeak by the CPAT and they show up to the academy expecting for the academy to get them into shape, that's not always going to be the case. They're just gonna wither on the vine, and I don't want to see that. So, trying to help as many cast a wide net and help as many people as I can get to that.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And the reason I ask is, from a physical therapy and rehab standpoint, I've had the pleasure of rehabbing a couple firefighters in the past, and I've seen some various injuries, elbow, just tendinopathy type stuff, to lower back, to ACL. And there's a big trend in the PT world right now for return to sport criteria. So we look at things like hamstring quad ratio, we look at jumps and hops and that sort of thing. But, while jumping and hopping are great tools, they don't really tell me a whole lot about someone's ability to return to, their ability to return to firefighting. And I think that, if and when I need to do a return to sport test for a firefighter, because as we already established, we're treating this as a tactical athlete with an emphasis on the athlete. I'm not just running my normal strength tests and my normal agility tests and all that. I'd also like to kind of develop a little bit of like, hey, let's do a hose run. I don't know if it's going to be 100 feet or 200 feet, but grab a hose, run with it, and let's see how we do with it. Let's do a ladder climb and leg lock, or let's do just a general ladder lift, or let's break down some of these different things that we've discussed for over an hour already, Lee, and let's actually look at them before someone goes back to their job of a firefighter after a serious injury like this. Because, unfortunately, I've seen a lot of PTs out there who never really assess someone's ability to go back to what they were doing. They just kind of say, well, it's been 6 months or it's been 8 months since you tore your ACL. You're good to go. We'll see you later. And I think that we can do a lot better than that. And instead of just making it a timeline thing, let's make it a criterion-based thing. Let's make people prove that, hey, I have exactly what it takes to go back to what I was doing before, to do it safely, to do it well. I think that we can certainly elevate our standards and elevate our practice that way.
And I don't want to get outside of my lane, not being a PT, but I certainly think that that's easy enough to do if you sit down and do that needs analysis, just like you would for a soccer player with an ACL injury. You just a SWAT officer, a wildland firefighter, a structural firefighter. I mean, it doesn't take any amount of time for a smart practitioner just to kind of look at the needs analysis and decide whether they're just a general bicep tendon tear protocol is going to be enough to get them back into to calls for service. So I don't think that there's a high barrier for that to happen, and I think that would be good for everybody down the road.
Yeah, no, definitely, and it's the kind of thing I think people know we should do it now. Now it's just a matter of, hey, let's actually do it. Lee, as we start to wrap up here, is there any kind of closing thoughts or closing remarks or anything else you want to throw out there today?
No, and I'm hoping that maybe we reached a few people that weren't aware of all that goes into being in the fire service, and maybe we caught some people that are in the early phases of moving themselves in that direction, and maybe we'll stop them from working in a direction that's not going to be conducive for their goals, and maybe show them what probably is going to be a better way to go, a better road to go, and they can move forward in a direction without steering off to the left or the right, and keep going straight to their goal of being in the fire service.
Definitely. And I know you have a lot of resources and you help people yourself doing that, Lee. So for people who want to find out more about you or what you're currently up to, where can they find you at?
You can go to kaizengroundworks.com, our website. We're getting ready to publish some of our first standalone programs. We do have private training up to 7 athletes at a time, and my team, I have a handful of advisors that have delved into everything from tactical medicine to SWAT to regular police. We even have a naval aviator, so we have quite a few people that can advise us on certain areas that I might not be 100% valuable in, but we could do private training, and also any department that, or somebody that works for a department that needs some sort of consulting and doesn't have anybody that's familiar with the strength and conditioning world when it comes to the tactical athletes, we can reach out, and we have that available to you too. We're on most of the social media. I think we have a heavy presence on Instagram, so that's probably going to be a good place to really kind of get an idea of what we're all about, is checking out our Instagram page and website. But if anybody needs help in that, don't hesitate to reach out.
For sure. We will link to all of that in the description below too. So if you didn't quite catch that, you can just check there. Lee, man, it's been a pleasure. It's been great talking with you and diving into all things relating to, the needs of a firefighter and how we can better approach that from a strength and conditioning and physical rehabilitation standpoint. And I'm excited to dive into more with you in future episodes.
I appreciate it. It was a great time. Anytime you want to talk about this stuff, just reach out. I enjoy it.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Brawn Body Health and Fitness Podcast. If you liked this episode, please make sure to share it with a friend, subscribe so you don't miss any of our upcoming episodes, and leave a review. This way we can spread knowledge and motivation and help reach more people. Thank you again for listening, and I'll see you next time.